Hello and welcome to the lecture. Well, in the early 90s, following the collapse of the USSR and the gradual integration of post socialist Eastern Europe into Western capitalist liberal democracy, a certain wave of optimism was in the air about the prospects of the continent. Um, Now, not everyone was optimistic, and surely the situation on the ground was much more difficult as many thought. Um, a pertinent example of this was the transition from socialism um, of the composite state of Yugoslavia. The transition, as we shall see, erupted in a series of civil war followed by violence and genocide, genocide and genocidal practices. Was this the result of ancient hatreds, of um, the intrinsic backwardness of the Balkan people, as some people proclaimed at the time? Well, I don't think so. And surely these Orientalist theories about the propensity that Balkan people and Eastern Europeans have to violence have long been discredited. What we will do in this lecture is to first I'll start by giving you a background on what was Yugoslavia. I don't take anything for granted. Um, when and how did the civil war start? Which were the main opposing sides? Uh, an overview of how the war became brutal, and this is the case study of the siege of Sarajevo. Sarajevo is a small city in Bosnia Herzegovina. How did the war end? The Dayton agreements. Then the curious case of Bosnia Herzegovina, and obviously the genocide that we have in Srebrenica in the mid 90s, 1995. And then also something that we tend to forget, the return of the war in the late 90s in the guise of the NATO-led intervention in Kosovo. So let's dive into history, into 20th century history, to see what Yugoslavia was, how it traveled over time, this structure, this composite state, and then gradually reconstruct the moment of the transition from socialism to liberal democracy, capitalism, the Western system of governance that ended up in a series of wars, civil wars. Now, Yugoslavia, that old composite state, bringing together people who would acknowledge themselves as South Slavs. Well, the state comes into existence during the First World War, formally in the period between around 1918, and the state lasts quite long across the 20th century until formally 1992. It is comprised by different components, by lands and peoples, very diverse lands and peoples, operating in the late 19th century within, broadly speaking, three units. One unit was the Austria-Hungarian Empire, and this is the case of some Croat lands and Bosnia-Herzegovina. The Ottoman Empire, this is the story of Serbia that becomes independent at some point, a key component of the Yugoslav state, and Slovenia is also kind of part of the Habsburg Empire, and a bit of it in the Ottoman Empire. So the big kind of pointer here to bear in mind is that we have people that have similar languages and diverse cultural backgrounds that recognize themselves as South Slavs. mainly Croats, Slovenes, and Serbs, not only, but mainly. Montenegrins is another example. You may have heard of Montenegro. And all these people, through a complicated process during the First World War, understand that their future together makes more sense, and they come up and create this composite political union. And I should also mention here that the Yugoslavia that comes into being after the First World War is a religiously diverse Yugoslavia as well, comprised of Muslim and Christian, Catholic and Orthodox populations. At first, the name of the state was the Kingdom of the Serbs, the Croats, and the Slovenes, to give a direction of the main but not only composite nationalities. In 1929, there is a royal coup, and the name Yugoslavia is adopted. Now, part of the story of Yugoslavia in the interwar period is, I'm simplifying here for the purposes of clarity, a story of Serbs driving towards the creation of a more centralized state. And they achieved that in the early 30s when, in fact, the king of then Serbia takes charge of political life in Yugoslavia and kind of establishes a quasi-authoritarian regime. And there's also a story of a vision, rather, of a more federal state that is mainly pushed by Croat intellectuals and politicians. So centralism, federalism are linked usually with Serbian political elite and the Croatian political elite. And there's all sorts of debates going on in the interwar period. A historian who's written a book on this period and topic calls the Yugoslav state of the interwar period a quote-unquote elusive compromise. Now, as we move on in the Second World War, it's important to note here that the state was invaded by the Axis forces in 1941 and was effectively partitioned. There is a German direct rule that extends in the Serbian provinces. A puppet state is erected in Croatia, and other territories of that Yugoslavian unit were annexed by Hungary, Italy, and Bulgaria. An important thing to note here: after the occupation of the Nazis, the Communist Party of Yugoslavia leads the country's resistance and forms the Yugoslav partisans, the so-called National Liberation Army. And again, it's interesting to note here, the story becomes more complicated, that the Yugoslav partisans were not only fighting the Nazi occupiers, they were also in conflict with Serbian royalist and nationalist groups and Croatian fascists who were collaborating with the Nazis, so-called the Ustaše. I'm highlighting this because a lot of the political dysfunction, the political conflicts that will emerge in the 1990s, and it's effectively, as we shall see in the 1990s, we have an acute nationalist conflicts between the different components of the Yugoslav state. So a lot of the debate on this draws back harkens back to the Second World War. For instance, for certain Serbian nationalists in the 90s, Croatians are equated to the fascists who supported Nazi rule. So all these things are to be taken with a grain of salt, but the broad picture here is important to note, that the Yugoslav partisans, mainly led by someone who we shall see becomes the father of the Yugoslav state after the Second World War, fight the Nazis on the ground. Now, how is post-war Yugoslavia reconfigured? A key point here to understand is that the composite state remains after the Second World War. A new federal republic is proclaimed based on more federal terms, under the guise of socialism, and crucially under the leadership of Marshal Tito, who was the leader of the Yugoslav partisans. Tito is extremely important because his personal rule kind of seals the fate of Yugoslavia in the post-war period. Um, he is in frequent disagreement with Russia and other forces in the socialist camp. And after 1948, Yugoslavia kind of does something on her own, as it were. It pursues a policy of neutrality, so it doesn't quite formally align with the Soviet camp, and joins the so-called non-aligned movement. That's to say, a group of countries neutral from the two competing power blocs. Now, the Federal Republic, and there are many accounts that the sort of that argue that the sort of federalism that the post-war socialist Yugoslav state enacts is somewhat of a working structure. Now, the Federal Republic has Belgrade as its capital, the current capital of Serbia, and then capital of the Serbian component, and is comprised of 6 republics, an autonomous province, and an autonomous district, which was part of Serbia. And here is how the socialist Yugoslav federal state works. And I'll give you a moment to have a look at the map and acquaint yourselves with the map, because it's extremely important to understand what happens. There is a socialist republic of Serbia, as we shall see here, that is comprised of the autonomous region of Kosovo. We'll get to Kosovo later. The autonomous region of Vojvodina. There is a Socialist Republic of Slovenia, of Montenegro, of Macedonia, of Croatia, and a Socialist Republic of Bosnia-Herzegovina. Each republic has its own parliament, its own local authorities, its own local politicians. The figure of authority here that guarantees the function of the state is Marshal Tito. And this is just to give you a sense what happens from 1991 onwards. The current, as it were, boundaries of the region are not much different to what we had in the socialist times, although there are quite a few differences, and we can discuss about this in the tutorials. Now, a turning point gradually as we go to the 90s is the 1980s. Why? Because the death of the father, the de facto father of the Yugoslav nation, sets in motion different nationalist conflicts and tensions. In Kosovo, for instance, there have been tensions, and the tensions begin to rise between the Serbs and the Albanians who are comprising that particular socialist republic. At the same time, given the personalistic leadership of Tito, the Yugoslav Communist Party gradually loses its influence and finds itself in turmoil. Yugoslavia faces economic hardships and crises. Its public debt rises. And also towards the end of the decade, as happens in other parts of Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe, we have social unrest, mainly labor strikes. And what happens gradually from as we shall see, 1989 to 1992, there is a process of effectively the disintegration of the state. And that this transition leads to a number of civil wars. It's not one war. It's important to note. It's not, sometimes scholars claim the Yugoslav war. It's not, it's many conflicts, a series of wars and conflicts. And the most important of them are the Croatian War of Independence that starts in 1991 and it ends in 1995. It's bare mentioning here that Croatia, from this lot of countries or independent nations, is the one state that's currently, or has been for some time, member of the EU. The Bosnian War, which culminates in a wide-scale genocide and the so-called Srebrenica massacres, and leaves us with a weird autonomous protectorate-like state currently. And also, the two aforementioned conflicts are settled in 1995 on the backs of the Srebrenica massacre. And later, we should not forget that at the end of this process, towards the end of the 90s, we have the Kosovo War that is framed as a war fought by the NATO-led forces against Serbian nationalism. Now, some of the protagonists of the violent transition, not tradition. There is no violent tradition in this part of the world as in anywhere. It's all about the way the political game has evolved over time. So, transition. Slobodan Milosevic, an extremely influential political figure and one of the perpetrators of genocides and crimes against humanity. He rose in the ranks of the Yugoslavian apparatus in the 1970s. In 1986, he becomes the head of the Serbian Communist Party. He plays up the card of Kosovo for the domestic Serbian crowd, the idea that Kosovo will and always be Serbian and not Albanian. And his rise to power in Serbia, and at the time Serbia is the power stronghold of whole Yugoslavia, is pretty much attributed to him playing up the card of nationalism. In a world that is changing, Milosevic speaks about the destiny of the Serbian nation, how Serbia is in a way in a better position to manage the affairs of Yugoslavia, and has this kind of grandiose visions about Serbia. And a result of this that is fateful for Kosovo is that in 1989, Kosovo is stripped of its autonomy and is directly subjected to Belgrade. Now, how is Kosovo in the early 1990s? It's an autonomous province of Serbia, as I mentioned earlier. The majority of the Albanian Muslims here, 10% of Serbs only live in Kosovo. But, and this is the problem with nationalism, for Serbian ideas about what their state and their country is, Kosovo plays an integral part. And this harkens back to, the 16th century and ideas about the Serbian national identity and folklore. Now, in the 1990s, and this sets the ground for what follows, the Communist Party of Yugoslavia formally collapses. Milosevic escalates the nationalist rhetoric. In the 14th Congress of the Communist Party, Slovenes and Croats push for more powers to the constituent republics. This is a steady refrain here, right? We have Croats throughout the history of Yugoslavia pushing for more federalized policies, better, bigger freedoms to the constituent elements of the state. However, the Serbian delegation under Milosevic upholds the primacy of Serbia and opposes any plans for economic reform. The problem here is the response is that the Croatian and Slovenian delegations walk out. And this is this signals de facto the end of the compromise that has brought the Yugoslavian state together, the end of the Yugoslavian Federation. So the state's constituent republics, remember the Socialist SR, Socialist Republic of Croatia, Socialist Republic of Slovenia, etc., they hold multi-party elections for the first time. So what happens in these elections? In Serbia, Milosevic's nationalist message wins him large support, mainly the countryside. Montenegro in this story, who is today an independent state, kind of goes together with Serbia. In a way, its political elite kind of follows the lead of Serbia. And indeed, they form in that period a federal republic of Yugoslavia, a minor kind of state, federal state nominally comprised between those two. That doesn't exists to this very day. In Slovenia, Slovenia is by far the wealthiest Yugoslav republic. It has many ties with the West. It has a more westernized and privatized economy. I should mention Slovenia is also part of the EU and has been for a while. In 1988, there are various political parties formed already calling for Slovenian independence. And in the 1990, a coalition of anti-communist parties win control of parliament. The Slovenian army is established, and in the end of the year 1990, there is support for a referendum of independence. And by June 1991, Slovenia declares independence, and one of the countries that immediately recognizes Slovenia and has a very interesting involvement in matters of Yugoslavia is Germany. Now, Slovenia in the story of Yugoslav wars somehow manages to keep out of the fray. Croatia. The post-communist leaders in Croatia are hardcore nationalists. That's something we need to remember. They declare Serbs as a national minority. They extend citizenship to all Croats residing abroad. 10% of the Croatian population were Serbs. And obviously, the Serbs living within Croatia resented these new policies. In the spring of 1990, nationalists in Croatia win the elections. In June 1991, Croatia declares independence. And again, Germany recognizes quickly the Croatian independence, and that sets the path for the war with Serbia. Serb paramilitaries take control over Croatian territories that have Serbian majority and conduct, and this is the first time in this war that the term and the practice of ethnic cleansing comes into the fray. And finally, a second protagonist here, rather than Milosevic, is the leader of Croatia, Tudjman. He has a very interesting trajectory. He's a bit of an outsider in Yugoslavian politics, but he's a historian, by the way, a fellow historian. He plays the card of nationalism very well. And in 1990, once free elections are restored, his party becomes a ruling party within the Socialist Republic of Croatia, and he becomes the president of that republic, and then leads the drive to create an independent state, and surely the war that ensues with Serbia.